Hello. All right, I got a good one for you today. Um, so we've been talking obviously so much about the law of assumption approach, the Joseph Murphy, Neville Goddard approach. And like most of you watching this channel, that's how I found out about a lot of these manifesting principles, and I still regularly go back to both Murphy and Neville, in terms of understanding and trying to implement these teachings. I still turn to them more often than I turn to, most other LOA teachers. However, if you're familiar with my stuff at all, as a lot of you are, you understand that I am strongly against using one type of teaching, like saying that the law of assumption is it, and that the law of assumption is the only way to do things, and that the law of assumption is actually different than the law of attraction or any other term we want to use. I think that the more flexible and open-ended we can be applying these principles, the more satisfied we will be with them working in our lives in whatever way they can. And I always focus on feeling good on the inside. That's like really my focus and what I want to share with you is if you feel good on the inside, you feel good on the inside. In my opinion, that's like the most important thing, usually, if not always. And if you feel good on the inside, if you feel more inwardly calm and at peace and relaxed as you go through your day-to-day life, chances are that your outer world is going to start to change or reflect this increased sense of contentment that you feel, right? Really simple. But it seems, especially in the Neville community, and the law of attraction community is very similar too. I mean, we get stuck doing certain techniques, and we get stuck thinking this is how I do something, and this is the only way to do something. And, like the point of my podcast, why I created my podcast, Law of Attraction Explored, is just to explore that there's all these different ways of doing this. There's all these different ways of feeling better on the inside, and then seeing that sense of, self-worth be reflected on the outside. So many different modalities and approaches we can utilize. And, we talk a lot about Emile Coué on this channel, as well as, Murphy, who are big into autosuggestion and affirmations and saying things. So we've been talking about that stuff a lot. But the reason that I like to talk about that so much is not just because I think it's a good technique. It is a very good technique, but I'll be the first to say that you don't have to use any type of affirmation technique and have these principles work wonderfully in your life. Why we talk about Murphy and especially Coué so much is the underlying points they're getting at. Coué is saying that what you are saying to yourself, in other words, what you are thinking to yourself throughout the day, is then going to kind of reflect in your life. You know what I mean? So if you're thinking generally positive thoughts as you move through your day, you're going to feel pretty good. Again, generally speaking, we're speaking in generalities here, okay? But if you are overwhelmed by negative thoughts, you're not going to feel as good. But look, approaching it just through doing affirmations or doing certain specific visualization exercises is a very limited way of going at this. And we can actually go at this from just like an emotional feeling standpoint, as most of you know. I mean, thoughts lead to feelings. And you could argue that feelings lead to thoughts too. I mean, they're so intertwined. But a lot of the time, we find ourselves feeling kind of anxious or overwhelmed or tight, and we don't know why. I would argue, in all likelihood, it has something to do with our thinking patterns. And that goes back to Coué and why we always touch on Coué's principles. But often we feel so stuck in these feelings that it's much more effective to deal with the feelings themselves that overwhelm us. And that is when doing, quote unquote, energy work is so helpful. And why the teachings of somebody like David Hawkins, his book Letting Go, and just dealing directly with the feeling and ignoring the thoughts associated with it and just let the feeling be there, why this is so powerful. So I thought I would read from a good book today that's a modern book. It's called Bending Reality by Victoria Son. Victoria is a good teacher, and this is a good book. Again, it's not the kind of book that's going to like profoundly affect everybody who's watching this, but she makes some good points. And I wanted to just read a couple excerpts that underscore why just doing a certain thing, certain technique is silly unless that technique is getting you the results you want. A lot of times, you get into Neville and you think, well, I have to visualize, or I have to say, isn't it wonderful? Isn't it wonderful over and over again, or something like that. And you're stuck. And the truth is, you can do a bunch of other techniques as well that will work just as effectively if you find them, if you're open to them. And again, that's why the podcast exists in the way that it does, is to show you different techniques you can use. So Victoria, in this book, she has these different codes, which are no different than laws or whatever, to bend reality. We don't have to discuss that. But one of the main things she talks about is this idea. She says, feel whatever arises. Feel whatever arises. If you're familiar with Hawkins and letting go, this is going to obviously ring a bell. And it ties into why it's so hard to just assume a state and then have that state continually be there, a positive state. Because all this stuff is going to come up. You're going to feel all this stuff that seemingly contradicts the desired state. Victoria is saying, you got to feel all that stuff. You want to feel all that stuff. That's how the change happens. Now, that's a totally different approach than the stuff we usually hear about from Neville or Murphy, okay? So she writes here, feel whatever arises. This is the key code to bending reality. The subconscious needs to be cleared of its contractions in order to access the 0-point field, which gives rise to physical reality. I know that of everything in this book, you'll probably experience the most resistance to this code. Feel whatever arises. Very powerful. Feel whatever arises. I'll link above to, a short video I did summating the letting go process, of David Hawkins, as well as Claire Weeks, who's really good at explaining how to feel what comes up. But this approach is so much more nonverbal and so less thinking oriented than a lot of the Neville and Murphy stuff. And it's just as important to know about for a lot of you. And, personally, I like to talk about the absolute method. And the absolute method really is very nonverbal. When you think about God, it doesn't seem like you're thinking about God when you really get into it. It's like something else. There's a sense of release, this nonverbal sense of wholeness when you get there. And that is, what can be life-changing, right? So a couple pages later, explaining this code, just to give an example here, and this is very helpful, this passage. Victoria writes, this client made the connection between his current day frustration at not getting his way with the fear he had growing up from not being able to stand up for himself, and the sadness of feeling helpless. As an adult, when he feels helpless, he gets angry. This pattern leads him to feel stressed and anxious whenever he doesn't get his way. In my experience, there are few pure business problems. There are many personal patterns that show up in how we conduct business. By going deeper, we solve tactical issues in the short term, and we also resolve the underlying patterns that solve these challenges in the long term. So, in this example, she's talking about someone dealing with business and anger. But I'm sure you can relate to many aspects of your life that are not just business-oriented and don't just deal with anger, but deal with these uncomfortable feelings of, sadness, shame, discomfort, anxiety, all this stuff that's deeply in there. We can feel that and process it and have our life change just by doing that. And that involves no specific manifesting goal. A lot of the time, it just involves feeling what's there and processing it. And you can, of course, still have specific goals. But if you use this kind of approach, it's more about the feeling. And the feeling is really what's so important to realize a lot of the time. And that's what, again, we get, I would say, like, thrown off, where we get too in our head and we don't allow the feelings to be there and work through them.